I want to thank all of you for coming out on a cold January day. And I want to thank Julie for the invitation to come and speak again. I had a really good experience here back in the summer when I came, and it's a good opportunity to soak up some of that good unity love that you all love to give me. You know, Julian and I have been friends for a long time, and we share a lot of common interests. We're both interested in dreams and the symbolism of them, and we're both interested in handwriting analysis. But mostly, we're interested in lunch. And we like to go and low down Panera. Anyway, I would like to say that I started organizing this speech back in the summer after I spoke on the influence of technology on our spiritual lives. I thought I'd made some really good points, but the most common comment that people said to me was how much they enjoyed the jokes. Now, I know I have a good sense of humor. It's served me well in my life. But the praise that I got for a few good quips seemed kind of out of proportion to me. Why would good humor be so worthy of so many remarks? Is it that laughing on Sunday has become so rare? I didn't think so. But being too intellectual is sometimes a curse. I might have just accepted the compliments and gone on, but I decided to do some research. I prepared a PowerPoint for you. The first article that I came upon when I Googled humor and spirituality was in New Yorker 2013. Religion has an image problem. Religion's public image is grim. It's all fire and brimstone, severe and reproving. Even New Age religions seem to emphasize the life of what's good for you with a whiff of tofu and kale. When I read that, I thought, I think somebody needs a hug. How did we come to this? I had a lot of questions about reading this article, and the answers that I have found are the stuff of this message this morning. I invite you to come along with me as I try to respond to questions such as, how did we arrive at this sad state? Is humor unchristian or unspiritual? Is there humor in the Bible? Did Jesus have a sense of humor? Actually, I've been thinking about these questions for quite a while. I want to show you a picture of someone who was very important to me. Do you recognize her? If you don't know her face, you might recognize her name. She is the composer of the song, I am free, I am unlimited. And you see her name every week if you're a regular here. Janet Bowser Manning and her husband Wayne were the ministers here long ago. Janet and I had a special bond. She married me. I mean, she performed my wedding ceremony. It will surprise some of you that I was married one time. It was the longest 15 minutes of my whole life, but that wasn't Janet's fault. In tribute to my friend and mentor, Janet Manning, I have a small gift for you, and Chris will help you with it at the end of the service. Janet Manning was a phenomenon, a teacher, minister, songwriter, playwright. Darren and I were in one of her plays together. It was called The Voice of Planet Earth, and I got to wear yards and yards of blue chiffon. I'll let Darren tell you what he wore. He played Adam in the Garden of Eden, but it's not what you're thinking. Now, one of Janet's rarely seen personas was Toodles the Clown. and Toodles would come out for parties and picnics here at the church. Toodles didn't talk very much, but would play a riff on her recorder if you spoke to her. It was in a conversation with Janet about the role of clowns and jesters and tricksters in our literature that the first seeds of this talk were planted so long ago. Following that conversation, I bought this book, The Humor of Christ by Elton Trueblood. I took the book home and put it on my someday when I retire stack of books. I finally got around to reading it back in the fall. In full disclosure, I have shamelessly borrowed from this book in preparing this message today. I started my official research for this talk with the early Puritans. The very first law the Puritans enacted upon arriving in America was to ban gambling. 7 months later, they decided that smoking in public was bad. I guess smoking in private was okay. While there was no rule against laughter, there were serious restrictions on many pleasures. There's a famous quote by M.L. Mencken: "Puritanism is the haunting feeling that someone somewhere is happy." Another author that I read, Reverend James Sweeting, reports that the Puritan people themselves were the brunt of much vicious laughter all over Europe, and the painful experience of that humiliation led them to sort of demonize laughter itself. Good Christian people need to focus on the rewards that would come in heaven. Puritanism evolved into Reformed Puritanism in the 18th century. When I was in high school American literature class, I was forced to read an essay by this man: "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." It was self-published and widely distributed among churches in the early colonies. Jonathan Edwards was himself a very grim fellow who chided against all forms of pleasure. Edwards thunders at us: "The wrath of God burns against sinners, their damnation does not slumber. The pit is prepared, the fire is made ready, the furnace is now hot, ready to receive them." Almost single-handedly, Jonathan Edwards forced God into a mold of punisher and forced Christians down a pathway that focused on sin instead of virtue, focused on fear instead of love. Remember, frightened people are easier to control. So you see, there's plenty of precedent in our history for the dire state of humorless worship that we find ourselves in. Next, I wondered about lessons that came from the Bible. According to Gerald Arbuckle, author of Laughing with God, many of the Old Testament stories would have seemed naturally humorous to their original audience. Noah building a colossal boat far from the water's edge, Balaam, a prophet who doesn't recognize an angel, but his donkey does, Jonah hiding from God, and Jacob, who tricks his brother Esau out of his birthright. These stories were examples of folk humor that served a specific purpose. They made the figures of the Old Testament more human, in case you imagine them to be more majestic than you think, and you think you had nothing in common with them. But I want to consider some examples from the New Testament. St. Peter, for example, is often portrayed in ways that could be seen as comical. Simon Peter is often presented as bursting in enthusiasm, if not always with discretion. It was Simon Peter who impulsively hopped out of the boat to walk on water. Jesus had to rush to save his impetuous friend. But clearly, Jesus cherished Peter and designated him as the rock upon which he would build his church. In renaming Simon and giving him the name in Aramaic, Cephas, which means stone, later translated into Latin as Petrus, or rock, we see Jesus' sense of humor. He gave Simon a nickname and made the joke that led all of the Catholic Church to consider Peter to be the first pope. So you can see, Jesus was a punster. Jesus could make a joke. He could also take the joke. At the beginning of the Gospel of John, there's a remarkable story of Nathanael, who has been told that the Master is from Nazareth. Nathanael responds, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" It was a diss on Jesus' hometown. Now, I know a lot about this kind of humor. Oops. Okay. That's a coal mine, it's hard to see. My family came out of eastern Kentucky. The men in my family decided to climb up out of the coal mines and move to Ohio, where they became farmers and storekeepers. I was born in southern Ohio, so I'm a Buckeye. But I remember an avalanche of Kentuckian jokes when I was growing up. And I am proud to report that nobody laughs louder at a Kentuckian joke than a Kentuckian. I love that about my people. I love it that we can laugh at ourselves. And if you call somebody in my family a hillbilly, they won't take a swing at you and they won't be insulted. They'll just give you a checkerboard smile and say, yeah. However, when I went away to college, I had to face a real prejudice against Appalachian people. I showed up with my homemade clothes and my funny way of speaking, eggs instead of eggs, and wash instead of wash. And people assumed I was stupid. Even some of my professors looked at me sideways and asked if I was certain that college was really the place for me. Now I'm going to tell you a secret. If you are the smartest person in the room, but people think you're stupid, you can work that as an advantage. That's what Jesus did too. You see, he saw in Nathanael a resource. Nathanael's humor didn't insult Jesus, it seemed to delight him. Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. We know that Jesus did not want yes men in his ministry, and he often inquired about how the people regarded him. Who do they say that I am, for example? And he knew that Nathanael would always tell him the truth. And he rewarded Nathanael's humor by making him a disciple. There's another example from Jesus that I want to share with you. It takes some unpacking to get to the point, but it has a sweet ending. So if you try to stay with me, I want to tell you. We know that there are many places in the gospel where Jesus gives an intelligent one-liner in response to a comment. And sometimes he answers a question with a long parable full of exaggeration and hyperbole. These were the characteristics of the humor of the time. To worry about the speck in another person's eye while ignoring the log in your own was the kind of contrast and comparison that made his stories so memorable. According to Elton Trueblood, Jesus was practically a stand-up comedian, and he lists 30 wisecracks that Jesus made in reply to his critics. But there are a few places in the New Testament where we read an actual dialogue an actual give and take conversation between Jesus and another person. And to this explanation, I am indebted to Elton Trueblood, who patiently and lovingly led me to a true insight about this story. We read in the Gospels that Jesus has just had a challenging interaction with his Pharisee accusers, and now Jesus has decided to withdraw for a rest. This is not unusual. There are many places in the Gospel where Jesus chooses solitude in order to recharge and to pray. In this story, Jesus goes into a house to escape the crowds, and there is a woman lying in wait for him. You might say she was stalking him. This Canaanite woman has come to ask Jesus to heal her child who is at home sick. We know there are few forces in humanity that are more formidable than a desperate mother seeking help for a sick child. When Jesus entered the house, the woman immediately fell to the floor in front of him. It is in the dialogue between the two people that Jesus gives her a mild reprimand about acting like an animal and groveling on the floor. The woman banters with him, and it is in this interaction that we get the expression, crumbs from the table, because the woman recognizes that Jesus is teasing her. Jesus evidently enjoys the banter. He may have respected her courage and her determination. We know that Jesus held women in high esteem and showed great warmth for them. Jolene reminded us a few weeks ago about this scripture. It wasn't manna from heaven that supported Jesus' ministry. It was women. And I'll bet you Jonathan Edwards never preached that scripture. At any rate, we know that this little story about the Canaanite woman has a happy ending. Jesus rewarded her humor and her courage. Go home, your child is healed. It's a wonderful story when viewed from the perspective that Jesus loved humor. I think it's sad that so much of the preaching in Christian churches focuses on the last 2 weeks of his life: the betrayal, the passion, the crucifixion. We tend to forget that the ministry of our way shower began at a party. Jesus went to a wedding, and they ran out of wine. And Mary, who was, after all, a Jewish mother, dispatched her son to remedy the situation. Jesus turned the water into wine so the party could continue. Can you even imagine him not smiling and not laughing at a wedding party full of people who were full of wine? I want to share one more story. This one is from the Old Testament. I came to a new insight and understanding of this story, and it was a real emotional experience for me, so I want to include it. We all know about Abraham. Did you ever stop to think that he was the ancestor of 3 major Western religions? We know the story of Sarah, his wife, who was barren, and who took her handmaiden to Abraham. The issue from that union was Ishmael, who became the ancestor of Islam. Then, many years later, Abraham and Sarah were in their 90s, and 3 messengers from God came to enjoy their hospitality. These visitors, sometimes translated angels, told Abraham that his wife Sarah would conceive and have a son. Abraham laughed so hard he fell on his face. And Sarah, who was eavesdropping, also had a great laugh. Well, the visitors knew the future, and a son was born to Sarah. She named her son Isaac, which means he laughs. Isaac became the ancestor of the Jewish people and subsequently the Christian people. Now think about that. Our legacy as worshipers of one God, one divinity, started with two people laughing, probably laughing so hard they cried. How did the Puritans miss that? How did Jonathan Edwards miss that? I'm fond of saying that I always teach what I need to learn, and this story was a great gift to me. I'm supposed to laugh. It is the nature of God's love to be an expression of joy. And sometimes the unintended consequence is that I'm humbled. If I can laugh at myself, then I can forgive myself. And if I can forgive myself, I am well on my way to forgiving others. Even Jonathan Edwards. In closing, I want to tell you a teacher story. You knew there had to be one, didn't you? A young teacher full of idealism wanted to help her first graders grow toward an attitude of tolerance and appreciation of diversity. She invited her 6-year-olds to bring something for show and tell that was representative of the family's worship. The first child, held up a rosary. She was Catholic. The second child held up a Star of David. He was Jewish. The third child opened a greasy paper bag and brought out a casserole. She was Baptist. In honor of my 2 Kentuckian Baptist grandmothers, I have made casserole for you today. So join us in Wilson Hall, and we'll lift a fork in tribute to my family that love to eat and love to laugh.